The docking bay of the ICV Iron Veil smelled like metal and cold air. The ship was enormous. It was the biggest vessel in the entire Interstellar Coalition fleet, and standing inside it made most people feel very small. The ceilings were high. The walls were dark gray. The lights were sharp and white, the kind that left no shadows anywhere. Everything about the place said that it was built for large things, serious things, things that did not break easily. Lieutenant Dana Cole walked through the docking gate with a bag over her shoulder and looked around like she had seen places like this before. She had. Not this exact ship, not this exact bay, but she had walked into rooms that were not built for her whole life. She was used to it. She adjusted the strap of her bag, took a slow breath of the cold air, and kept walking. She was 29 years old. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall. She weighed 132 pounds. And her hair was dark brown and pulled back tight against her head. Her face was calm. Not blank, not bored, just calm. The kind of calm that comes from a person who has decided a long time ago not to waste energy on things that do not matter. Walking beside her was Captain Owen Briggs. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a short gray beard and tired eyes that still managed to look kind. He had served in the human military for 22 years. He had spent 6 of those years working alongside Dana, and he carried her second bag without being asked and said nothing, which was the thing Dana appreciated most about him. They were met at the inner gate by a group of Rakai soldiers. There were 5 of them, and they were impossible to miss. The Vrakai were the dominant military force in the coalition. They were built like buildings. The shortest one in the group stood nearly 7 feet tall, with 4 thick arms and a wide chest covered in dark ceremonial armor. Their skin was a deep greenish gray. Their faces were flat and wide, with small black eyes that missed very little. The one standing at the front was a commander. His name was Vrath Kell. He wore more decorations on his chest than the others, and he stood with the ease of someone who had never in his life been made to feel small. He looked at Owen first, which was natural. Owen was the one who looked like a soldier. Then his eyes moved to Dana. And he looked at her the way someone looks at something that is clearly in the wrong place. He said something in his own language, low and rumbling, and 2 of the soldiers behind him made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. It was not mean exactly. It was the kind of laugh that comes from pure surprise, the kind that says, "This cannot be real." One of the Vrakai soldiers near the back leaned toward the one beside him and said something quietly. The translation device on Owen's belt caught it and rendered it in flat English. It said, "Did they send us a child?" Owen did not react. He had been doing this long enough to know that reacting would not help. He introduced himself and Dana to Vrath Kell in a steady, polite voice and shook the commander's hand, or rather one of them. Vrath Kell looked at Dana again and asked, in accented but clear English, whether she was assigned to the medical unit or the administrative office. Dana said, "Combat Exchange, Lieutenant 3rd Division." Vrath Kell said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at Owen like he was waiting for a correction. Owen said, "That's correct." Vrath Kell made a sound low in his chest that might have been the Vrakai version of a shrug. He turned and led them deeper into the ship without another word. His soldiers followed. One of them glanced back at Dana as they walked, and the look on his face was not hostile. It was just confused. And the way a person looks when something does not fit into any category they have. Dana walked behind them and said nothing. She looked at the walls, the ceiling, the layout of the corridors. She noticed where the security panels were. She noticed the way the Vrakai soldiers moved, how they placed their weight, how much space they took up, where their balance was. She did this quietly, with her face still calm, the same way some people count exits when they walk into a new room. Owen walked beside her, and once briefly glanced at her face to check on her. She gave him a small look that said she was fine. He nodded and looked ahead. Their quarters were in the officer section of the ship, which was cleaner but no warmer. Dana's bunk was standard issue, built for a coalition officer of average size, which meant the mattress was wider than she needed, and the shelf above the bed was a little high. She did not complain. She unpacked her bag with the same quiet efficiency. She did everything, folding things and placing them in order, taking up exactly as much space as she needed and no more. On the small desk beside the bunk, there was a printed schedule. It was the Coalition's joint training program, a 10-week rotation of drills, briefings, and assessments designed for exchange personnel. Dana read through it twice. She was a person who read things twice. The first time to understand them, at the second time to think about them. Near the end of the schedule, listed under Week 4, was an event called the Joint Readiness Trial. It was a physical combat assessment held in a live ring, no weapons, no powered gear. Exchange officers were expected to participate. The results were logged in official Coalition records. Dana read that section a third time. Then she pulled a pen from her jacket pocket and made a small mark beside it. Not a circle, not an underline. Just a small mark that meant she had seen it, and she was thinking about it. She set the schedule down and sat on the edge of the bunk. The ship hummed quietly around her, a low and constant sound like the breathing of something very large. Through the small porthole above the desk, she could see the dark of open space and one pale star at the edge of the frame, very far away and very still. She sat there for a while, not doing anything, just being quiet. She was not anxious. And she was not angry about the laughter in the docking bay, or the questions, or the look on Vrath Kell's face. She had stopped carrying those things a long time ago. They were too heavy, and they slowed her down. She thought instead about Week 4. Then she lay back on the bunk, closed her eyes, and went to sleep. Owen Briggs sat in his own quarters one door down, writing notes in a small paper journal he had carried for years. He wrote one line before going to bed. And it said, "They have no idea." He closed the journal, turned off the light, and went to sleep too. Outside, the Iron Veil moved through space without sound, carrying its thousands of soldiers and officers through the dark between stars. In the docking bay, the Vrakai soldiers had already moved on to other things. They had already forgotten about the small human woman with the calm face and the bag over her shoulder. That was, of course, the first mistake. The first morning on the Iron Veil started early. Dana was awake before the ship's alarm system signaled the start of the day cycle. She was dressed, had done 40 minutes of her own training in the small open space between the bunk and the wall, and was sitting at the desk reading when the corridor outside began to fill with sounds of other people waking up. The first 2 weeks were structured. There were briefings in the morning, coalition orientation sessions in the afternoon, and shared meals in the main officer mess hall. The Vrakai soldiers were not rude to Dana, exactly. They were something more subtle than rude. They were simply unaware of her. They spoke around her at the table. They did not include her in conversations about training. When assignments were handed out for observation drills, Dana was placed in the back row with the administrative staff. Not because anyone said she did not belong at the front, but because no one thought to put her anywhere else. She sat in the back row and watched. That was fine with her. Watching was useful. On the 4th day, Coalition medical staff ran physical evaluations on all exchange personnel. It was routine. Dana sat in the medical bay and let them run their instruments over her without saying anything. The staff were Mirellan, a smaller and quieter species than the Vrakai, with long fingers and pale gold skin. They were professional and careful, and they spoke to each other in their own language while they worked. Dana's translation device caught most of it. They noted that her bone density was below the Coalition average. They noted that her cardiovascular output, while strong for a human, was far below Vrakai standard. They noted her height and weight and wrote both down with the kind of careful neutrality that people use when they are trying not to say something unkind. While one of them said quietly to the other that it was remarkable humans had survived this long given their physical limitations. The other one agreed. Dana said nothing. She looked at the wall while they finished and thanked them politely when they were done. What their instruments did not measure, because they were not designed to look for it, was the response speed of her nervous system under threat. They did not measure how her tendons worked, and how much force they could store and release in less than a second. They did not measure her reaction time, which was in the top fraction of a % for any human ever tested. They did not measure the thing that lived in her body that had been built, not by size, but by years and years of learning how to be fast when fast was the only option. Their instruments were looking for the wrong things. She did not correct them. On the 6th day, Dana submitted a formal request to use the ship's combat simulation bay during off hours. The bay was a large room near the lower decks with padded floors and a range of training equipment designed for coalition military use. Most of it was sized for Vrakai bodies, which meant the resistance settings were set high, and most of the grip handles were wider than her hand. She adjusted what she could and used the rest as it was. Her request was approved within the hour, and the officer who approved it added a small note in the system that said, "Low priority, no supervision required." No one thought it was worth watching. She trained alone every night for an hour after the ship's main lights dimmed. She did not need music or noise. She worked in silence, moving through drills that she had been doing so long they no longer felt like thinking, they just felt like breathing. Her footwork was small and exact. Her movements did not look powerful from a distance, so which was, she had learned, one of the most useful things about them. On the 9th night, she was not alone. Lieutenant Yura Ness was standing just inside the doorway of the simulation bay when Dana looked up. Yura was Mirellan, the same species as the medical staff, and she had been assigned as Dana's liaison officer for the duration of the exchange program. She was quiet and observant, and had, over the past week, done her job with a kind of careful politeness that Dana had come to appreciate. She was not the type to talk for the sake of talking. She stood in the doorway for a while without saying anything, watching Dana move through a sequence of drills near the center of the room. Then she said, "Where did you learn to move like that?" Dana stopped and looked at her. "Like what?" Yura said, "Like you already know where everything is going to be before it gets there." Dana thought about that for a moment, and then she picked up a water bottle from the floor and sat down on the edge of the mat. She told Yura about being 12 years old and going to see a doctor with her mother after a bad fall at school. The doctor had looked at her height and her build and her small wrists and said in a kind but definite voice that contact sports were probably not a good idea for her. He said she was too small. He said she was too light. He used the word delicate once, which he did not mean badly, but which landed in Dana's chest like something sharp. She told Yura that she had thought about that word on the way home and decided she did not accept it, not as a description and not as a direction. She started training the following week. Not to prove the doctor wrong, exactly, more because she had a sudden and very clear feeling that her body was something she had not yet fully understood, and she wanted to understand it. 17 years later, she understood it very well. Yura sat down on a bench near the wall and was quiet for a while. Then she said, "The trial is in 2 weeks." Dana said she knew. Yura said, "They are putting you against the 3 top Vrakai graduates." I saw the bracket. Dana said she knew that too. Yura looked at her carefully. She was trying to read Dana's face, but Dana's face was giving her very little. There was no fear there, no bravado, no performance. Just that same calm that Yura had noticed on the first day and had not quite been able to name until now. It was the calm of someone who had already done the thinking and was now just waiting for the doing. The next morning, Owen Briggs sat across a table from Admiral Sora Venn in the Admiral's planning room. Sora Venn was a senior coalition officer, Vrakai-born, with a long record and a manner that was precise without being cold. She served good tea, which Owen had not expected. She asked, professionally and without insult, whether it made sense to adjust the trial bracket so that Dana was not placed in the combat assessment tier. She said she was not trying to be dismissive. She said she simply wanted to make sure that all exchange personnel were placed where they could perform well and be evaluated fairly. Owen sipped his tea and said he appreciated the concern. He said Dana was where she needed to be. He said the bracket should stay as it was. The Admiral looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You are very calm about this." Owen said, "I've had 6 years to practice." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded once and moved on to the next item. But later, when the meeting was over and she was alone in the room, she looked at the bracket on her desk again and left it exactly as it was. She was, without quite meaning to be, curious. The week before the joint readiness trial, the mood on the Iron Veil changed. It was not a dramatic change. The ship still ran on schedule. Briefings happened on time. Meals were served and eaten. But there was a low current of energy moving through the corridors that had not been there before, the kind of energy that builds when a crowd of people knows something worth watching is coming. The Vrakai soldiers were louder at meals. They moved with a little more swagger. The 3 who had been named as trial participants, Grath, Velsor, and the veteran enforcer, Dun Heck, had become the center of a quiet kind of attention that they wore easily because they had worn it before. Dun Heck was the one everyone talked about. He had not lost a trial match in 11 years. He was 7 feet tall and moved with the heavy, easy grace of something that had been built to last. He spoke very little, which somehow made him more impressive, not less. When he walked through a room, conversations slowed. Not out of fear, exactly, or more out of the simple fact that he took up so much space, both physically and in the way people's attention moved toward him, that everything else temporarily became less interesting. He had heard about the human woman in the bracket. Everyone had. He did not laugh about it the way some of the others did. He simply looked at the bracket sheet once when it was passed around at dinner, said nothing, and handed it back. No one could quite tell what he thought about it. Dana, for her part, I spent the week quietly and without drawing attention. She attended every briefing. She ate in the mess hall at the regular time. She said hello to people she had come to recognize and listened more than she spoke. In the evenings, she trained in the simulation bay, but she trained differently now. She was not working on new things. She was working on memory, on making sure that what she knew lived deep in her body, below the level of thought, so that when the time came, she would not have to think about it at all. She also spent time watching. The Coalition kept recordings of all previous trial matches in a shared archive. Dana accessed them from the desk in her quarters and watched them in the evenings after training, sitting very still in the chair with her legs folded under her and her eyes steady on the screen. She watched Grath first. He was fast and aggressive, and a forward fighter who committed hard to his first move and won most of his matches in the opening seconds by sheer force of momentum. He was not reckless, but he believed in pressure, in pushing until the other person had nowhere to go. She watched Velsor next. He was older and more controlled. He fought by taking away space, gradually backing opponents into corners and then finishing with clean, practiced technique. And he had good balance and strong hips, and he used his size as a slow wall rather than a hammer. He was patient in a way that many opponents found frustrating. She watched Dun Heck last, and she watched him the longest. He was different from the other 2 in a way that was hard to explain quickly. He did not fight through pressure or patience. He fought through reading. He watched his opponents the way Dana watched things, with a stillness that looked passive but was anything but. And he let people come to him, and in the moment they committed, he was already somewhere else, turning their own movement into the instrument of their defeat. He was not flashy. He was precise. He had been doing this for 11 years, and he knew exactly what he was. Dana watched 3 of his matches back to back, then sat for a long time looking at the blank screen after the last one ended. The thing she was looking for was the moment just before his signature move. Every fighter had one. A small shift in weight or posture that came just before the big commitment, a kind of pre-signal that the body sent out before the mind fully decided. It was usually invisible unless you were looking for it specifically, and unless you had trained yourself to see things at that level. She found it in the second match. A slight lean to the outside of his left foot, a half-second before he initiated his throw. It happened every time. She checked the third match, and it was there again. Small, to consistent, real. She nodded once at the screen and closed the file. The other human exchange officer found her the next morning in the corridor outside the mess hall. His name was Pete Sully, a broad and solid former Marine with an easy grin and the kind of confidence that came from being good at things and knowing it without making a production of it. He was not on the combat bracket opposite any Vrakai heavyweights. His match was scheduled against a mid-level Mirellan officer, which was considered the more reasonable assignment for a human. He fell into step beside Dana and asked how her prep was going. She said it was going fine. He said he had heard about her bracket opponents and looked sideways at her. He said he was not going to tell her to be careful because he did not think she needed that, but he wanted her to know he would be in the stands. She looked at him. "Cheering," he said, loudly. "Front row if I can get it." She almost smiled. Back row is fine." He laughed at that, a real laugh, and then turned off toward the mess hall. She watched him go and thought that he was one of only 2 people on the ship who had not once looked at her with pity or confusion, or that particular version of concern that was really just doubt wearing a polite face. Owen was the other one. That night, Yura came to find her again. Not in the simulation bay this time, but in the observation lounge near the front of the officer section. It was a small room with wide, curved windows that looked out into space. And it was usually empty at this hour. Dana was sitting close to the glass with her legs stretched out on the low bench, looking out at the dark. Yura sat down across from her and asked if she was nervous. Dana thought about the question seriously, which was how she treated most questions. She said no, she was not nervous. She said she was doing the kind of thinking that needed to happen before a thing like this, or the settling down thinking, the making sure you have not missed anything thinking. But nervous was not the right word for it. Yura asked what it felt like. Dana looked out the window for a moment. She said it felt like standing at the beginning of something that was already decided and just waiting for the deciding to become visible to everyone else. Yura was quiet for a while. Then she said, "And done, heck?" Dana said, "I just need a few seconds." Yura looked at her carefully. That is either the most confident thing I have ever heard, or the most frightening." Dana said, "Probably both." She was still looking out the window when she said it, her face calm and still in the pale light from the stars outside. Yura sat with her for another hour and said very little. The iron veil moved through the dark, and somewhere deep in the ship, in his own quarters, Dun Heck sat awake and thought about the bracket, and for the first time in a very long time. And he was not sure what the next day was going to look like. He had not felt that in 11 years either. The combat ring was not large. It was a raised square platform in the center of the ship's main training hall, surrounded on all 4 sides by tiered seating that had been built into the walls. The floor of the ring was firm but with just enough give to absorb falls, and the edges were marked with a single line of white paint. There were no ropes, no barriers. If you stepped over the white line, you were out. By the time the first match was scheduled to begin, every tier was full. Coalition officers sat in the upper rows. Vrakai enlisted soldiers filled the lower rows and the standing areas along the back walls. Morellan crew members had come in groups and sat quietly in the middle sections. There were a few dozen human support staff scattered throughout, sitting close together the way people do when they are a small number in a large crowd. Pete Sully was there, near the back on the left side, sitting with his arms crossed and his chin up, watching the ring with a steady look. Yura was in the middle tier, close enough to see everything clearly. Admiral Sora Ven was in the official observation box above the ring, seated and still, her hands folded on the railing in front of her. The atmosphere in the room was warm and loud, the kind of noise that comes when a large number of people are looking forward to something. Most of them were waiting for Dunheck. His matches were always the thing worth watching. The earlier rounds were fine, but they were filler. Everyone in the room understood this to be true. Dana stepped into the ring from the left side entry and the noise did not change. There was a small ripple of reaction from the human section, a few people sitting up straighter, but the rest of the room barely noticed. She was wearing standard issue trial gear, plain and dark. And she had her hair pulled back the same way she always did. She walked to the center of the ring, stood with her feet shoulder-width apart, and looked at the opposite entry. She was not performing anything. She was not trying to look calm. She simply was calm, and the difference between the two things was visible, to those who knew what to look for. Grath entered from the right side to a deep wave of sound from the Vrakai section. He was the youngest of the three. With quick eyes and a wide stance that he settled into the moment his feet touched the ring floor. He was bigger than Dana by a large amount, but he moved lightly for his size. And he had the energy of someone who expected this to be over fast and was fine with that. He looked at her across the ring and his expression was not cruel. It was just settled, the way a person looks when they have already made up their mind about the outcome and are just waiting for reality to agree. And the ring official raised one hand and then brought it down. The match began. Grath came forward with controlled speed. He was not wild about it. He had been trained well and he knew not to lunge carelessly. He came in at an angle, trying to use his reach to force Dana to the left. He was thinking about her reach disadvantage, about the space between them, about using his length as a tool. He was not thinking about what she was doing with his momentum. When he committed to his first grab, but reaching across with his upper right arm, Dana was already moving. She stepped not away from his reach, but into it, past the dangerous part of it, into the space right beside his body, where his size became a problem for him, rather than for her. Her hands found his wrist and his elbow at the same moment. She did not fight his strength. She used the direction it was already going and added to it, spinning the force of his own movement into a tight arc that took him off his feet faster than his weight expected. He hit the mat hard. She was on his arm before he could reset, her knee across his shoulder, the joint lock set clean and deep. His body was not built to rotate out of it. He tried once, felt the specific resistance of a properly applied hold, and tapped the mat. The ring official called it. 9 seconds had passed. The room was completely silent for a moment. Not the silence of boredom. The silence of a room full of people who all saw the same thing and have not yet decided what to do with it. Then it filled back up with noise, confused and loud, and Grath rolled to his feet with a look on his face that was not embarrassment but pure surprise. He looked at his own arm. He looked at Dana. He walked back to the side entry and said nothing. Velsor entered the ring. He was older than Grath and heavier, and he had watched everything that just happened from the entry corridor. His face was composed. He was not the kind of soldier who let what he saw shake him quickly. He adjusted. He came into the ring slowly, settled his stance wider and lower than Grath's, and began to move around the edge rather than across the center. He was going to use the ring. He was going to make the space work for him, back her toward a corner and take the options away one at a time. It was a smart plan. But he moved her left, then right, and she let him. She gave ground without panic, stepping back in small, neat steps, keeping her distance and letting him read what he thought was a retreat. He was patient. He did not rush. He waited until her back was close enough to the ring's edge that she had maybe 2 steps of space behind her, and then he came forward with full commitment, his weight driving into the close of the distance between them. In the moment that his weight moved fully forward and could not be recalled, Dana dropped. She went down and under his center of gravity in one smooth motion, her hands finding his hip and the inside of his knee. And she did not push him so much as she redirected him, using the wall he had been hurting her toward as a surface to brace against and turn his own drive back into him. He went over and sideways at the same time, and the mat received him loudly, and she was on his shoulder before he could move. 11 seconds. He waited a moment before tapping, because some part of his brain was still processing what had happened. Then he tapped, firmly and once, and walked back to the entry with his head down, not in shame, but in the deep thought of someone who has just been shown something new. The room was different now. The noise was still there, but it had changed texture. It was sharper. It was the noise of people who had come to watch one thing and were now watching something else entirely, and some of them did not know yet how they felt about that. Dunheck stepped into the ring. The sound his entrance pulled from the crowd was automatic and deep. He was, in every visible way, the most impressive living thing in the room. He took his position with the ease of a person who was exactly where he expected to be, and he looked at Dana across the ring with eyes that held no arrogance, no anger, and no certainty. For the first time in 11 years, Dunheck did not know what was going to happen. He moved first, slowly, testing. He did not commit. He pressed at the edges of her space and watched how she responded, reading her the same way she was reading him. It was the most careful beginning of any trial match anyone in the room had ever seen from him. He was not being cautious out of fear. Then he was being cautious out of intelligence, and the crowd felt the difference. They circled, they tested, they moved together across the ring in a slow, careful exchange that looked almost like a conversation. Then Dunheck set up his throw, the one he always used, the one that had ended every match for 11 years. He moved into it with the same sequence he had used 100 times, his weight shifting to the outside of his left foot a half-second before the commitment. Dana saw it. She had been waiting for that specific half-second. She did not block the throw. She accepted its beginning, letting him initiate, and then she moved with it instead of against it. She took the rotation he was generating and turned it, added her own direction to it from underneath, and flipped the entire sequence inside out. Dunheck's feet left the mat in a way he had not planned, and for one strange moment he was airborne, and then the mat rose up to meet him. She came down with him, on her knee finding the center of his back, his arm locked at an angle that had no exit. She held the position and waited. The room was completely silent. Dunheck lay still for a long moment. He was not struggling. He was thinking. He understood, with the clear mind of someone who had spent decades learning this craft, that the hold was properly set, and he could not power out of it. He understood this was over. He tapped. 7 seconds. Pete Sully started clapping from the back row. That he was clapping hard and without any hesitation, like he had been waiting for exactly this moment and was glad it had finally arrived. The sound of it was loud in the silence, and it broke something open in the room. Other sounds followed, building slowly, and then all at once into something large and uneven and real. Dunheck stayed on the mat for a moment, after Dana stood and stepped back. Then he turned his head and looked at her. When he spoke, that his voice was quiet enough that only she and the ring official could hear it, but Yura's translation device caught it from the second tier. He said, "What are you?" Dana looked at him. Her face was the same as it had been at the start. Calm, present, not proud, not performing, just there. She said, "Human. We get asked that a lot." The day after the trial, the Iron Veil felt different. It was hard to say exactly how. The ship ran on the same schedule. The lights came on at the same time, and the mess hall served the same food. But the way people moved through the corridors had changed, just slightly, the way the air in a room changes after something important has been said out loud. People who had not spoken to Dana before now looked at her when she passed. Not all of them nodded or said anything, but they looked, and the quality of the looking was different from before. There was no laughter in it. There was something more careful, more considered, like a new piece of information had been placed in front of them, and they were still working out where to put it. Grath stopped her in the corridor outside the mess hall the morning after and said, in English that was careful and measured, that he wanted to ask her a question. She said that was fine. He asked how long it had taken her to learn what she did in the ring. She thought about it and said it was not really a single thing she had learned. It was more that she had spent years learning how to use what she was, and the ring was just a place where what she was became visible. He thought about that for a while, nodded once, and walked away. Velsor said nothing to her directly, but Yura told her later that he had spent the morning in the simulation bay alone, moving through drills very slowly, like someone rethinking something from the beginning. Dunheck she did not see until the third day. She was in the observation lounge, reading. When he came in and stood near the door, he did not sit. He said he had watched the recordings of the trial matches twice. She looked up from her reading and waited. He said that in the second match, when she went under Velsor, she had used the wall as a brace point. He said he had never seen anyone do that in a trial ring before. He said he had been trying to understand the geometry of it and could not fully work it out. She put her book down and explained it to him, and it took about 4 minutes. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said he understood. He stood there for another moment as if he wanted to say something else. Then he said thank you and left. She watched the door after he was gone and thought that she liked him, in the simple and straightforward way that you like someone who takes a thing seriously. The formal review board met on the 4th day. It was held in a meeting room near the Admiral's planning area. Dana sat on one side of the table with Owen beside her. 3 coalition officers sat on the other side, 2 of them Vrakai and 1 Mirellan. The purpose of the meeting, as stated in the official notice, was to review the outcomes of the trial and discuss any adjustments to the exchange program structure. What it turned out to be, once everyone was seated, was a room full of people who wanted to talk about what they had seen without quite knowing how to start. One of the Vrakai officers, a senior strategist named Gorath Val, opened by saying that 3 of the Coalition's top combat graduates had submitted requests for training access with the Human Exchange Lieutenant, and that this was unusual, and that the board wanted to understand how best to proceed. He said it carefully and professionally, but Dana could hear underneath it the same thing she always heard, the sound of people recalibrating. She said she was willing to work with anyone who wanted to learn. She said she had one condition before she agreed to anything formal. The board asked what it was. She said that the official Coalition exchange records currently listed human officers in the category of auxiliary support personnel. She said she would like that classification changed for herself and any future human exchange officers assigned to combat roles. She said the new classification should be combat-rated, unrestricted. There was a pause. The Gorath Val looked at the Mirellan officer beside him. The Mirellan looked at his notes. The second Vrakai officer, who had not spoken yet, looked at Owen, as if checking whether this was a serious request or a negotiating position. Owen looked back at him with a perfectly neutral expression that gave away nothing at all. The board took a short recess. When they came back, they approved the classification change. Dana said thank you, and that she would have a training schedule ready within the week. Owen waited until they were back in the corridor outside before he allowed himself to exhale slowly and look at the ceiling for a moment. Dana glanced at him. He said nothing, just straightened up and walked beside her, but she could tell from his face that he was pleased in the deep and private way that people feel when something they have believed for a long time is finally put in writing. That evening, the Yura brought 2 cups of something warm to Dana's quarters and sat across from her on the small chair by the desk. The room was quiet. Outside the porthole, stars moved slowly as the ship changed heading. Yura asked whether Dana ever got tired of it. She said she meant all of it. The proving, the walking into rooms and having to start from zero every single time. And the laughter in the docking bay and the instruments that measured the wrong things and the brackets that put her where no one expected her to last. Dana wrapped both hands around the warm cup and thought about the question properly. She said yes. Sometimes she did get tired of it. She said there were mornings when the idea of having to explain herself one more time to one more room felt heavier than it should. She said she would not pretend otherwise. But she said there was a way she had learned to think about it. She said that every room that underestimated her was just a room that had not been corrected yet. That was all it was. Not a judgment, not a final verdict, just a room with incomplete information, waiting to be updated. Yura said that was either very wise or very exhausting. Dana said it was both, usually at the same time. Yura smiled quietly and they sat together without talking for a while, which was a kind of conversation in itself. On the 6th day, a formal document came through military channels to Owen's desk. It was a training assignment request. The language was structured and official, but the content was straightforward. Dunn Heck, veteran enforcer, 11-year trial record, was formally requesting to be assigned as the primary sparring partner for the human exchange lieutenant for the duration of the program. The word he used in the request was not student. It was a Vrakai word that the translation service rendered in English as witness, someone who wants to observe and record a thing so that it is not forgotten. Owen read it twice. Then he picked up a pen, signed the approval at the bottom, and set it in the outgoing tray. He sat back in his chair. Through the narrow window of his office, space moved past in slow silence, black and vast and full of distances that no one had yet found the edge of. He thought about Dana at 12 years old, being told she was too small. He thought about the 6 years he had worked beside her and watched her walk into room after room after room of people who had already decided what she was. He thought about the silence in the ring after that first 9-second match, and the way it had spread through the tears like something physical. Now he thought about the word delicate and what it had cost and what it had built. He allowed himself a quiet smile, the kind that has nowhere it needs to go and no audience it needs to perform for. Then he picked up the next document and got back to work. Dana Cole, Lieutenant, 5 feet 4 inches, 132 pounds, began her 2nd month aboard the ICV Iron Veil on a clear sky day cycle with a full training schedule and a new classification in the official coalition record. She was no longer listed as auxiliary support. She was an instructor now. She showed up on time, with her bag over her shoulder and her hair pulled back, and she walked into the simulation bay where 4 soldiers were already waiting. 2 Vrakai, 1 Mirellan, and Pete Sully, who had volunteered for extra hours and was grinning from the corner. She set her bag down, looked at the group, and said, "Let's start from the beginning." And they did.